Okay, so hang on, got to admit a couple of people. There we go. All right, we've been talking about competition. We've been talking about predation. And last I checked, we'd been talking about ecological niches and ecological succession. Every species of living thing can be thought of as having an ecological niche. That, of course, is the total set of conditions under which a population of that species can persist. And when two organisms overlap in their niche, either one will drive the other to local extinction, or alternately, the two will evolve in such a way that they're no longer overlapping so much, which is what we call niche partitioning. One of the resources that's most important in defining an ecological niche is, of course, what an organism eats. And so what I want to look at today is the flow through an ecosystem of what we call biomass. Biomass is simply just living matter. All of the food that you ate could be called biomass. All of the bamboo leaves that this adorable panda is eating would count as biomass. And when you eat, some of that biomass is taken in to build you up, right? You make new molecules that you will need out of the molecules that you take in, right? We call that catabolism, if you remember from the very earliest of lectures. That's one of the basic things that life does. You grew from a single fertilized egg to a screaming newborn to a fine upstanding citizen because you ate and took molecules from your food and used them to build up more of yourself. So when you eat, you're transferring biomass from your food to you, and you're also transferring energy. Remember that the energy that you run metabolism on is stored in chemical reactions, and you get energy for everything that you do, from moving to thinking to growing to everything else. All of that energy ultimately comes from chemical bonds present in your food. So whenever you eat, both biomass and energy are transferred from the food to the eater. That panda is going to get the energy that it needs to grow and walk and do everything else that it does. And it's going to get the biomass that it needs to make more panda flesh from its food. Okay, that's pretty obvious. When we look at the way this plays out in an entire ecosystem, when we look at the way this plays out in the whole way, we can talk about multiple trophic levels within a given ecosystem. Trophic comes from a Greek word for to feed. So trophic levels basically means feeding levels. And when we look at any ecosystem, this works very well, for example, in the Jewel Moore Nature Reserve that you're going to be seeing this week. We can first divide up that ecosystem into what are called primary producers, which is all organisms that create biomass and energy. In all the ecosystems that you would know, that is done by the process of photosynthesis. This is basically what the plants are doing. Plants soak up solar energy, and they're able to capture some of that solar energy in the form of chemical energy. And they're able to capture some of that energy in the form of biomass because they can use it to take carbon dioxide and water and a few minerals and build more plant tissue out of that. That's what plants are able to do. Plants can grow. In other ecosystems, the primary producers might not be plants. In a pond, for example, the primary producers might be protists. There might even be photosynthetic bacteria. Whatever eats the producers directly are called the primary consumers. So if we're in the nature reserve, you might see a plant and you might see a bug eating the plant. It's not that uncommon, maybe not this time of year, but at some times of year, it's pretty common to find grasshoppers and things like that. Those would be the primary consumers because they're feeding on the producers. Secondary consumers feed on the primary consumers. So if you spotted, I don't know, a rat that had grabbed a grasshopper that had been eating grass, that rat would be a secondary consumer. Tertiary consumers feed on the secondary consumers. Quaternary consumers feed on the tertiary consumers. So many ecosystems, I'm listing 4 levels of consumers. In real ecosystems, there aren't necessarily exactly 4. There are some where there might only be 2. There are some ecosystems in the ocean where the number of levels of consumers might be as many as 9. It all depends. There aren't necessarily exactly 4. If you needed to talk about more than 4, you'd probably just say they were 5th level consumers, 6th level, 7th level, however many you needed. And okay, as we said, some ecosystems has fewer trophic levels, some have more trophic levels, and many organisms occupy several levels at once. If you're having a nice plate of fajitas, you're eating on more than one trophic level because the peppers and of course the corn in the tortilla and the lime juice, those are all from plants. But of course the beef is from a cow which eats plants. So if you eat these fajitas, you're temporarily both a primary and a secondary consumer at the same time. So real ecosystems can be a bit more complicated than this nice, neat level scheme that I've mentioned, because many organisms may feed on more than one trophic level. In humans, we often feed on more than one trophic level in the same meal. So just bear in mind that real world situations can be a little more complicated than this, but trophic levels are still a pretty good way to conceptualize how biomass and energy move through an ecosystem. So there's a diagram of typical organisms. Over on the left, this is what you would find in a prairie. This is what you could find in, the Jewel Moore Nature Reserve, where the plants down here would be primary producers because they soak up sunlight, they take in water and carbon dioxide and soil nutrients, and they store energy and build biomass. Those would be the primary producers. This grasshopper that's eating one of the plants would be a primary consumer. It's directly feeding on a plant, and it's taking some of that plant's energy and biomass and using it to maintain itself. A mouse eating a grasshopper would be a secondary consumer. A rattlesnake eating a mouse would be a tertiary consumer. I don't know if we have any rattlesnakes in the nature reserve. It'd be really cool if we did, but I've never seen any. So you're probably safe this week, probably. And then what we do occasionally see, because they've been known to nest in the trees, is this red-tailed hawk that's eating a rattlesnake would be a quaternary consumer. And so all of the energy and the biomass in this red-tailed hawk came from the snake, and all of the snake's energy and biomass came from the mouse, and all the mouse's energy and biomass came from the grasshopper, and all of the grasshopper's energy and biomass came from the plant. So that's what I mean when we say that energy and biomass flow in an ecosystem. And if you looked at an ecosystem out in the ocean, out in the blue water, the primary producers there are what's sometimes called phytoplankton. Plankton are just organisms that float, and phytoplankton would be photosynthetic bacteria and photosynthetic protists. In some parts of the ocean, they could be seaweeds as well, but this is what you would see way away from the shore, just floating out in the blue water. You have zooplankton or phytoplankton in the water that are the primary producers. Tiny animals and carnivorous protists make up the zooplankton, little shrimpy things and larval fish and critters like that, and they'll feed on the primary producers. And then let's see, here we've got some mackerel that are the secondary consumers because they're feeding on the primary consumers. And up here, that's a tuna, which is eating the mackerel. So that would be a tertiary consumer. And this orca eating the tuna would be the quaternary consumer. The highest level consumers, by the way, are sometimes called apex predators. They'll, because nobody feeds on them. Killer whales have no natural predators that can eat them, except for like SeaWorld. Red-tailed hawks don't have any natural enemies that prey upon them. So the highest consumers would be apex predators or top carnivores. Here's the thing. Imagine that you could go to, let's say, the prairie area of the nature reserve and somehow calculate the weight of every plant. And then let's say you could, be kind of hard to measure this directly, but maybe you could just take a really good vacuum cleaner and vacuum up every insect and measure the weight of all of those, and then measure the weight of the secondary consumers like the rodents and so on. And then imagine that you took the total biomass in each one of these trophic levels and you represented it as a horizontal bar. If you stack those bars one on top of the other, you'd end up with a diagram called a trophic pyramid, because it looks like a pyramid, maybe a stepped pyramid, like one of the Aztec pyramids. Okay, why is it shaped like a pyramid though? Every time you go from one trophic level to the next, in other words, every time something eats something else, energy and biomass get lost. Not all of the biomass that a consumer eats goes into building new biomass. In fact, most of it doesn't. And there's several reasons for this. Metabolism is never truly 100% efficient. And so consumers don't extract all of the energy that their food has. Some of it is just never extracted. Some biomass is always excreted, with the exception of one rather obscure sea snail, sea slug. Everybody excretes. Some biomass gets lost in the form of undigested waste. Dietary fiber, for example, is basically cellulose-rich parts of a plant that your body cannot absorb, so ends up pooping out. And then a lot of the metabolic energy that you get from food ends up as body heat, and that ultimately is radiated out to the atmosphere and lost, or it's used for maintaining instead of new growth. So that's what makes that trophic pyramid a pyramid. You can never support as many consumers by weight as you could the weight of producers, because every time a consumer eats a producer, only a fraction of the available biomass and energy in that producer end up going to make more consumer. And the proportion of biomass at a lower level that ends up incorporated in a higher level is what we call ecological efficiency. And the rule of thumb is that the ecological efficiency of each trophic level is about 10%. It can be more, it can be less, but 10% is a pretty good rule of thumb. By the way, this applies to agriculture as well, because it takes roughly 10 times the weight of feed, or 10 times the amount of, okay, sorry, Wagoner, haven't had my caffeine this morning. To raise an animal, it takes roughly 10 times the amount of that animal's weight in feed. If you're raising a 500-pound pig, it will take roughly 5,000 pounds of pig food. If you're raising a 2,000-pound cow, it will take roughly 25,000 pounds of grass and corn and other feed. The actual number can vary a bit depending on what animal and even what breed you're raising, but that 10% rule of thumb works pretty well. And that's why biomass pyramids look like this. One area of the ocean might have 1 million kilograms of phytoplankton, 1 million kilograms of microscopic photosynthetic protists and photosynthetic bacteria floating in the water. That might be enough to support 100,000 kilograms of little microscopic shrimp and larval fish and other critters in the zooplankton. That might be enough to support 10,000 kilograms of consumers that eat the zooplankton, like larger shrimp and certain fish. That might be enough to support 1,000 kilograms of larger fish, and that might be enough to support 100 kilograms worth of shark, maybe one big great white. That's what makes this a pyramid. Every time you go from one level to the next, every time one organism eats another, 90% of that biomass and energy does not go into making new consumer. And that's why each level of the trophic pyramid is roughly 1/10 the size of the level below. What that leads to, in some cases, is what we call biological magnification. Back in the 50s, and a pesticide called DDT was very widely used to do things like control mosquitoes and control agricultural pests. In neighborhoods where mosquitoes used to be abundant, I've heard stories of cities would buy these sprayer trucks that would just drive down the streets and just pump DNA right into the atmosphere, just spray it right in the air. There were stories of kids playing in the spray. DDT is relatively not that dangerous to people, but we don't use it now, and there's two main reasons. One is that it didn't take long for the insects that were being killed by DDT to evolve resistance to it just by good old-fashioned natural selection. We've already talked about that, and way back in week 5, I think I showed you some data. Here's the other reason. Sprayed DDT, it might stay on the fields for a while or what have you, but it will eventually wash off and end up in water. Now, DDT in water existed at an extremely low concentration, 0.000003 parts per million. Okay, a part per million is what, 1/10,000th of a percent. And so this is what, okay, sorry, gotta always have to think about moving this decimal point around. So this is what, 3/millionths of 1/10,000th of 1% was the concentration of DDT in water. Okay, that's really not much. In a typical lake, however, phytoplankton, right, that's little green algae and stuff, the stuff that makes a lot of lakes turn kind of a soupy green color in the summer, those phytoplankton were taking up DDT from the water. And the thing about DDT is, once it gets into an organism's body, most organisms can't excrete it and they can't break it down. Once it's in your tissues, it tends to stay. So in the water and in the phytoplankton, the little algae, DDT was at this incredibly low concentration of what, 300,000ths of 1/10,000th of 1%, something like that. Here's the problem. Every little microscopic shrimpy thing, little copepod and gammarid and all of these little algae feeding animals and algae eating protists in the water, every one of those eats many phytoplankton during its life, right? Every little shrimp might eat thousands of cells of phytoplankton, probably tens, hundreds of thousands. I don't even know how much. But every one of those little zooplankton eats a whole bunch of phytoplankton. And every time a little shrimp eats one of the phytoplankton, the DNA in that phytoplankton's body gets transferred to the shrimp and it doesn't leave, because DDT usually is not broken down and it's usually not excreted. So by the time you're at the zooplankton, the concentration of DDT in the bodies of the zooplankton was 0.04 parts per million. Okay, that doesn't look like a lot, but that's still what, a 10,000 times increase. And then every small fish eats hundreds of zooplankton. So the concentration of DDT in small fish was 0.5 parts per million. Every large fish has to eat many small fish. So the concentration of DDT in the big fish was 2 parts per million. And then fish-eating birds, notably ospreys and also bald eagles, in their bodies, they had a concentration of DDT equal to 25 parts per million. So the concentration of DDT went up by 10 million times between the water and the bodies of ospreys and bald eagles. Now, 25 parts per million still doesn't sound like an awful lot, but 25 parts per million is enough to start messing with the bird's metabolism, specifically the bird's ability to make strong eggshells. Eagles and ospreys that had DDT in their system were laying eggs where the shell was too fragile. The eggs would break as soon as they were laid, or if the eggs didn't break, the babies would not develop because baby birds draw on the eggshell as a store of calcium as they grow their own bones. So this is a big part of the reason why bald eagles, when I was growing up, were a federally endangered species in every state except for Alaska. They've made a really good recovery since we banned DDT. It's not that uncommon to spot them in Arkansas. They've been known to nest in some of the trees in Lake Conway, and I've seen them up in the Little Red River north of here. So they're doing a lot better. But what could have wiped them out was this phenomenon of biological magnification. Whenever you get something in food that is stored in the body and is not excreted and isn't broken down, then the concentration of that increases as you go up that trophic pyramid. So biological magnification is just a consequence of this trophic pyramid. Another example is mercury, and the federal government currently is advising young children, pregnant women, and nursing women to limit their consumption of tuna, and not to eat shark or swordfish. And the reason is that those fish are high-level consumers. There's always traces of mercury in the ocean. Of late, there has been an increase in levels of mercury in the ocean, and it's because traces of mercury are present in coal. And every time we burn coal, the mercury has to go somewhere, and a lot of it ultimately washes into the ocean. So levels of mercury have been going up, although they've never truly been zero. So every little phytoplankton, every little microscopic green blob in the oceans picks up teeny 999 amounts of mercury. That's not so bad, but every little microscopic shrimp eats thousands of little algae and stores the mercury from those. Every small fish eats thousands of little shrimp and stores the mercury from those. Every medium-sized fish eats hundreds of little fish and stores the mercury from those. Every big fish eats, I don't know, hundreds of medium-sized fish, and every tuna might eat hundreds of big fish, because tunas are really large and eat pretty much anything they want to. And the concentration of mercury goes up at every step, because once you've got mercury in your tissues, it's very hard to get rid of it, and there's no way you can break it down. And so reasonable consumption of shark, swordfish, and tuna is probably okay, but mercury can be especially dangerous to very young children. It causes brain damage. And, once you're grown up, your brain is fairly tough, but it's really bad for developing children or fetuses to get poisoned by mercury, because that can have lifelong effects. That can be really bad if you get mercury poisoning at a very early age or even before birth. That's why the US government recommends that young children, pregnant and nursing women should limit their tuna consumption and avoid shark and swordfish. Those are the fish that are likeliest to have high enough levels of mercury in their tissues that they could actually be dangerous. There, never let it said that I don't give useful advice. Okay, that's a picture I took in the nature reserve a couple of years ago, and you might be able to tell it's the stump of a tree. Growing out of the stump of the tree are these things that have these curved bands on them. Right, so there's one, and there's another one. All of these things that look like little shelves sticking out of the sides of the tree. You'll see these yourself tomorrow or Thursday. These are fungi, and fungi are classic examples of decomposers. You have producers, that's the plants. You have consumers, that's often animals. Decomposers break down the dead. Remember that the visible part of a fungus like this is just the fruiting body, or the sporocarp, if you remember that word, as you should. Remember, the final is cumulative. That sporocarp is what the fungus is using to spread its spores, but the real business end is the network of filaments. Remember hyphae? The main body of a fungus is a network of filaments called hyphae, and the mass of filaments is called a mycelium. And the real work of the fungus is being done is this network of microscopic filaments that are growing all through this stump, all through the wood, and very, very slowly breaking it down, using that dead wood as a food supply. Do a very nice, complicated mycelium there. And as the fungus does this, the wood may get discolored. The wood may become weaker and weaker. It will eventually start to crumble. You've all seen what rotten wood looks like. And given enough time, it will eventually just crumble away and end up becoming part of the soil. Decomposers, by breaking down dead organisms, ultimately recycle the atoms that make them up. If we had no decomposers, then everything that died would just sit there and never be available for anything else. But ultimately, all of the atoms that made up this tree are going to get returned to the atmosphere or to the soil, and ultimately they'll be available for something else to live on. And many, many, many bacteria are decomposers. Most fungi are decomposers. You might get a certain, some decomposing animals would include things like termites and bark beetles and other insects that can live on dead wood. Anytime you've picked up a rotten twig in the forest, you've seen examples of decomposers at work. And then, of course, the same thing is true, for animal bodies as well as plants. Something that dies in the forest, an animal that dies, if nobody comes along and eats it, it'll rot. And rot or decay is nothing but bacteria and fungi and maybe certain insects and things as well, breaking down that dead body. And ultimately, all of the atoms that made it up get returned back to the atmosphere, or they go into the soil. And given enough time, they'll end up in the bodies of new organisms. Nothing in an ecosystem is truly lost, because very important thing that goes on in an ecosystem is what we call cycling, which just simply means that atoms, chemical elements that are necessary for life, go round and round and round and round and get passed on from producer to consumer to decomposer. And we will probably not have time to go over this in as much detail as I wanted to, but the first type of cycling I wanted to talk about is called the carbon cycle. And what drives the carbon cycle is photosynthesis and respiration. Photosynthesis is the chemical magic that plants and algae and things like that can do to take carbon dioxide right out of the atmosphere and stick carbon dioxide gas molecules together and make more complicated compounds out of it. Basically, they're able to create new biomass out of carbon dioxide, water, and a few soil nutrients and things like that. We used this term way back when, but just as a review, converting carbon dioxide gas into more complicated compounds is called carbon fixation. And we'd say that producers can fix carbon. They can take it out of the atmosphere and turn it into larger and more complicated compounds. Okay, if that were all there was to the story, the atmosphere would eventually run out of carbon dioxide. But of course, there are consumers that eat plants and consumers that eat plants. And of course, there's decomposers as well. And as a major part of their metabolism, they carry out respiration. Okay, carbon fixation is taking carbon in a chemically simple form, like carbon dioxide gas, which is just one atom of carbon stuck to two oxygens. Taking carbon in a simple form like that, and being able to put those simple molecules together to make more complex molecules like sugars or starches, or ultimately other types of molecule as well. So fixation refers to the way that some living things can take small molecules and use those as the source of much larger molecules. Right? Every atom of carbon in your body got there because you ate it. And you either ate plants or you ate something that ate plants. And what plants ultimately do is take carbon dioxide gas and fix it, meaning that they build big molecules out of it. And then you depend on eating those plants for big molecules. And when you break down larger molecules, the waste product that you put out is carbon dioxide gas. It's present in every breath. Whenever you breathe out, the air you're breathing out contains a higher concentration of carbon dioxide gas. That goes into the atmosphere, and ultimately the carbon dioxide gas that you breathe out will get taken up by a plant and fixed and used to make more plant biomass. And then a consumer might eat that plant and breathe out carbon dioxide, and so on. So you have this infinite loop of plants fixing carbon by taking carbon dioxide and making it into complex molecules, and consumers and decomposers breaking down those molecules and respiring out carbon dioxide. So the two processes, photosynthesis and respiration, balance each other. Now, there can be a little bit more complicated things than that, because fires can put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Volcanoes put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The gas that comes out of typical volcanoes contains a lot of carbon dioxide. And then there are some geological processes that can pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, like the slow weathering of certain minerals that contain a lot of silica. We're not really going to worry about that, but know that there can be more to it than the simple carbon cycle. But the main driving forces would be photosynthesis and respiration. And so every breath out that you make releases carbon dioxide that the plants can feed on. And then as the plants grow, some of them will create edible parts that you can eat, and that's the carbon cycle for you. You get complex molecules from plants, and as you break them down, you put CO2 into the atmosphere. Plants take CO2 and fix it by converting it into more complex compounds that they need. And that's actually a good place to stop. So I will go ahead and stop the recording.